Good morning, everyone. I'm Chad Koulis, Executive Director of the Midway Chamber of Commerce. Thank you so much for being here. As I just mentioned, we want to get right into the program, so I'm going to do a quick introduction of Commissioner Jim Schowalter. He was appointed the Commissioner of Minnesota Management and Budget by Governor Tim Walz in September 2020. He also had held the position under Governor Mark Dayton, and he was State Budget Director from 2004 through 2011. He has most recently been at Health Partners, where he has served as Senior Vice President responsible for partnerships and agreements with care providers. Please welcome Commissioner Jim Schowalter.
Thanks, Chad. I appreciate the invitation and getting a chance to talk with you a little bit about the November forecast and the budget and economic implications in it. Appreciate your flexibility in letting this be a little shorter. As you can all well imagine, we're balancing a few different balls at the same time. Obviously, pandemic and pandemic response is front and center for the administration. In addition, the special session is coming up next week, and the question is out there right now of whether there's additional action to be taken. So just appreciate the chance to go through the presentation really quickly, give you an idea of the key messages and key information that you want, and then open it up for some quick questions. I'll have a hard stop at 9, but I think we can get a long way. I just also want to shout out to Megan. Great to see you. I know being a former St. Paul resident and Megan, we used to work together on issues, so it's just very cool to see you out there. So with all that, the budget and economic forecast is really a couple of big numbers, and it's sort of that mystery of how could a recession that looked like it was going to be way worse than the 2009 forecast recession yield less impactful challenges to the state's budget. And that's really where we are at. Since we last talked, the May projection of a deficit has been eliminated with this forecast. And instead, we're seeing about a $600 million surplus for the current period. That is achieved without use of any of the budget reserve. In addition, for this 2-year budget, we see a shortfall for the upcoming 2 years, but at $1.3 billion, which, while a challenge, is nowhere close to the $5 billion shortfall announced in May. Behind this rosier picture, you'll see that we do have better revenues than anticipated in May, but it's still not the same kind of outlook that we had anticipated last February. There are still significant challenges and still significant things we need to learn. One of which is that our spending actually has gone down rather than going up. So there's a lot of sort of counterintuitive things happening with this recession that are all getting rolled into this forecast, and we'll talk about those a little bit. But before I do any of the numbers, I just want to say, we are really well aware that the pandemic has impacted all Minnesotans, and it's brought just a long line of tough news, challenging news, discouraging events. But one of the key things here is that has really been concentrated, particularly concentrated amongst low-income workers and households. That is where the economic and social impact has been the hardest. And this forecast really underscores that. So hopefully this forecast is a little bit of good news, gives us a chance to react, learn, and get our state going again in the future months. So the next slide really gives you the short version of the budget information. What you see here is it's been a swing of about from about a $3 billion deficit. It's about a $3 billion swing from about a $1.9 billion revenue change, along with about a $1.1 billion improvement in spending. And I'm looking at the wrong slide, so that's okay. This is the 2 biennium slide. Sorry about that. Well, you got the 2 bienniums. So you got about a $3 billion change in the current biennium, along with changes in the subsequent biennium. It's basically the improvements that we saw in this forecast are not one time. They're continuing across the horizon, and as a result, we have a small projected balance in the current biennium. We still have about a $1.3 billion challenge in the 22-23 biennium. There's a change in the budget reserve on this slide of $491 million. Just so you know, That is not a forecast change. That's actually a reduction in the budget reserve that was associated with the last end of session budget deal. So for context, what you're thinking about, and we've all been in this mindset since May, is that the pandemic was going to be worse than the 2009 recession, that it was going to create a similar kind of impact on the budget. And what we're finding right now is the answer is no, that it's actually somewhat less. Let's take a look at the next slide. There's a lot of still volatility in the economy. It's still a lot of uncertainties, but this gives you a sense of sort of how we have learned and understood the changes since February. At the time, the state had about a $48.8 billion revenue estimate. We had full employment. We had money on the bottom line. Because of COVID, we knew that that was a big risk at the time. We didn't know the impact. By April and May, the administration, the legislators, all the decision makers wanted additional information. So based upon the best information at that point, we were expecting about a 5.4% reduction in GDP. That led to reductions in sales tax and income taxes, that $3.7 billion change. Right now, based upon what we've seen so far, I think we overshot. That right now we're saying that the revenues for the biennium are about $47.1 billion rather than the 48.8 that we started at. Next slide. That outlook is shown here. What you see is that in 2009, the Great Recession, as you may remember it, about 2.5% reduction in gross domestic product at the time. At the time that the forecast in May was put together, our economists were expecting a 5.4% reduction in GDP. It didn't turn out to be that bad. It turned out to be a 3.6% reduction, but still, or at least that's where our current estimates, but still what the bottom line is, it's actually still worse than what we were anticipating or what we experienced back in 2009. What's changed is how that's impacted Minnesotans and their incomes. On the next slide, what you'll see is that the growth in the employment has changed substantially over that period of time. We've basically grown from the Great Recession, picked up more than 300,000 jobs, and in just a couple months, all of those jobs went away. While we anticipated a quick bounce back for many of those jobs, and we experienced a quick bounce back for many of those jobs, it is nowhere close to complete. That that job growth has started to taper off. And basically persons who are in the service industry, persons who are in low wage jobs, who have to be there in person, are more than disproportionately impacted, because those jobs are not coming back nearly at the same rate as individuals who can phone in, who can have a Zoom call. And so as a result, what we're seeing is that we're picking up some of those jobs, but we're not anywhere close to the pre-recession employment level. On the next slide, what you see is the key indicator for the state revenues. We don't actually tax GDP. We tax salaries and wages, we tax sales. And so while there was a 4.8% decrease in wages and salaries back in 2009 associated with that decline in GDP, look at what we're seeing and projecting right now in 2020. Even though the GDP decrease is bigger than what happened in 2009, we're seeing actually decline in wages and salaries to be much less. What's happening is that both our progressive tax system, it's turning out to be much more resilient to this kind of recession because it's a progressive tax system. In addition, it is that the distribution of lost wages and salaries is not uniform. It doesn't go across our economy. It's concentrated on lower income households. And that is seen and experienced by many Minnesotans. And it also shows up here because obviously with a progressive tax structure, that means that we lose less revenue even though the wages and the hurt is just as much. So the next slide gives you the next sort of looking surprise that we found in the February forecast is that consumers, we expected to spend less. You would expect with the GDP contraction, with expected decrease in revenue, in wages and salaries, that people would spend significantly less. You see that dotted line sharply digging down? That was what was built into our May estimates. The sort of more smooth line was our February estimate, where you sort of go on trend. With the impact of COVID, with stores shutting down, with people losing their jobs, we would expect sales to go down. Instead, what happened is it went the other way. You probably know anecdotally people who have bought a patio set so they could talk with their neighbors outside. They were bored and they were shopping online at night. That seems to be happening a lot more than anybody would have expected. In part, again, because people found different ways to spend their money. So at least for the short term, we're seeing sales tax actually go up from where we had estimated, substantially more than from where we estimated in May, and even more than we had anticipated in February. That is part of it, another big part of the reason why our revenue picture looks better than we had anticipated just a few months ago. Next slide is there's risks associated with this. There's obviously the path of the pandemic. So, we've done a couple of legislative briefings yesterday, and it always comes up like, is the shutdown included in this? Is this congressional action included in this? The answers quite simply are yes and no. That we did include and adjust this forecast for the current restrictions on activity. And that does impact the economy, it does impact this forecast. We don't know if those will continue. So a continued closure would impact this forecast negatively. But again, remember, this is a 5-year forecast. On the positive side, we don't have, and our national forecasters don't have a congressional stimulus package built into their assumptions. Just a couple months ago, they did, but because with continued inactivity, we couldn't count on it. So if that happened, that would in fact help the economy and help the economy substantially, because we're seeing UI benefits starting to expire, small business assistance necessary, and really some of these things are best and most completely handled from the federal government. These will amplify the economic uncertainty that we see going into the next few months. Business and consumer confidence, survival of local businesses and nonprofits, and really the course of federal fiscal policy. So while the state is really well positioned compared to other states at this point, we still have a lot to learn. And there are still some very, very big decisions that are going to be made outside of the domain of the forecast. Going forward, let's look at the next slide. The long-term budget outlook shows a winnowing of that budget gap. That's kind of good news, but realize that that doesn't include the impact of inflation. By law, we don't include inflation in expenditures. So as a result, revenues grow because they are inflated, expenditures don't, so they don't. If you included estimated inflation, you'd see that we have a pretty significant and ongoing structural challenge. Not a surprise in the midst of the economic turmoil that we have right now. And really significantly different than what we faced just a few years ago in 2009, when we had virtually no budget reserve to manage through it. The state is in a much better fiscal position, and I think a more sustainable position than we would have anticipated even just a month ago, given this news. So that's kind of my rush through the forecast. I really appreciate your interest in I know I'm seeing some other additional people like Andrea coming in here. It's like, I know there's good questions out there. So I think that's the most valuable exchange. And Chad, just turn it back over to you and your members. Let's chat about this news and what you're curious about.
Great. I want to open it up for questions. People can put it in the chat. If people want to, they can shout it out too. I'll start just asking a question. What kind of impact could another federal stimulus package have on our outlook?
Obviously quite positive. I think it is positive at the household level simply because there's certain things that the federal government can get at, like UI extensions, help for continuing small businesses, the PPP program, things like that, which would, I think, give people some level of certainty and confidence going into the next few months. We continue to assume that there's going to be opportunity for the economy to rebound in the next 6 to 9 months, but we're really not anticipating things to take off or accelerate until late next year. Between now and then, it's just a lot of uncertainty. And the more that the federal government can step in for Minnesota and other states to step in and help people know that we're going to make it through that period, the better off I think consumer spending will be, consumer confidence, and ultimately our economic activity and our ability to rebound and get back to normal.
Mhm. Great. Well, Andrea from Comcast says, what keeps you up at night that worries you?
Thanks, Andrea from Comcast. There's plenty of candidates. I think the big thing right now is there's just so many changing pieces. So it is uncertainty about congressional action. It is trying to work through a special session, even as we're trying to piece together a governor's budget recommendations. There is probably behind the scenes, the worst part is I think, imperative to use federal money and state money as quickly and well as possible, even though it's going to expire, in part because it's going to expire on December 31. When the federal government put out COVID-19 relief funds, I don't know that they necessarily assumed that we would be in the worst part of the pandemic at the end of the year. And so as a result, we're basically right now under current law going to lose some of money unless we find ways to spend it in the next few days. Same thing for some of the state relief dollars. The legislators and the governor did a great job of acting quickly, getting that money out there. But much of that money also needs to be authorized in the next couple of weeks. So we've done, I think, a good job of responding. We have used that money more aggressively than some other states. That has helped our response. But ironically, even as we're thinking about the next couple of years and the budget challenges that are there, right now, a lot of it is around how are we going to pay for testing next month? How are we going to pay for vaccination and contact tracing in a couple of months from now, or other activities that are really necessary for part of our pandemic response? Right now, we don't have a lot of great options, and we're trying to figure that out. So I think the shifting priorities and the short-term urgencies, along with the long-term questions, are what keep me up at night, Andrea. Thanks.
You mentioned the vaccine. This might be a tough question to answer, but any projections on how the forecast shifts based on when we get the vaccine, how readily available it is? What are we looking at? When is majority of Minnesotans going to be able to get the vaccine, and what does that impact the forecast?
Well, certainly the national outlook is built on the assumption that vaccines would start to become available this month, next month, with limited amounts available in the subsequent months, so that we really wouldn't get to a sort of a broad population vaccination until this summer and fall. If we're going to do it faster than that, great. If it has different impacts, great. That's part of the risk, I think, that we cite early on. I think we've got kind of a middle course where we expect a logical, ambitious rollout of the vaccine, but human nature has us all hoping that, it'll just millions of doses will be available immediately. We'll be able to sort of resume normal life immediately. Our assumption is that it's going to take a while, and it's all positive. It'll provide, I think, emotional lift, but that it'll take a while for vaccinations to get broadly distributed enough that I think business activity and just frankly personal activity will start to look more normal next summer.
There's been talk about how At first, we weren't sure, was it going to be a V-shaped recovery? It's looking like a K-shaped recovery. Can you talk a little bit about some of the industries we have in Minnesota that are going to be successful, or your expectation is they're going to do better in the next few months or in 2021?
Good question. Now, I want to start by just saying I think Minnesota is well positioned. And in general, I think our economy is always broadly distributed. We have mining, we have services, we have sales, we have insurance. We have many different industries. And in fact, we look more like the national economy than most states, much more like the national economy than most states. And as a result, I think the corporate headquarters, the sort of white collar, the remote activities that are continuing to do well in Minnesota, because frankly, those offices, those operations can continue, are part of the engine that keep us going forward. States that are more dependent on sales, in-person sales, on tourism, obviously our hospitality going to be hurt much more. I don't have a particular pick for a business or activity that right now is thriving, except that general characteristic that we're going through a shakeout, that entrepreneurship on rebuilding models for sustainability is what Minnesota's done well. And I know that there's been pockets and instances across the board, whether it's in healthcare, whether it's in service delivery, supply chain. We have innovators that are able to respond to that kind of moving mark. And that's where Minnesota has looked a lot different than some of our neighboring states. And I expect will continue to come out of this recession looking well because of that.
Great. A question from Jeff Fensky from Fensky Law. On one of your slides, it showed a huge jump in stadium funds. Any chance pull-tab funds will go back to charities, the original intended beneficiary?
Well, there are, certainly the pull tabs still benefit charities. The growth in e-pull tabs was really passed with the stadium in mind. And that is, again, a good eye on the charts, because that was another one of the surprises you wouldn't have expected with bars closing or being interrupted at points in time, that we would still see a rise in charitable gambling. And yet those activities are continuing to not only do well, but thrive. So I think that stadium account is going to be a point of continued discussion, both for charities, for the Vikings, for the city of Minneapolis. We're all looking at that, I'm sure, and saying, how do we deal with the current obligations, current opportunities, and make sure we're getting that money to the right place. I think a lot of people will have different opinions about that. And when the number gets as big as it does, everyone will undoubtedly throw down their ideas.
So we've got the legislative session coming up soon. What recommendations would you have to the legislature on how they can help the economy the best?
I think the first thing is help businesses, help individuals know that we're going to make it through these next 6 months, that we have to continue to act quickly so that disruptions in businesses, in long-term care facilities, that homeless shelters and long-term and home food shelves keep going. Because I can tell you on a daily basis, we're getting questions and concerns of serious nature of how is it going to work? So that is, I think, the first order of business. And that's where I know the legislature is pointed right now. I know that's really what's driving the congressional questions, is that we need to make sure as public officials and governmental entities, really the only ones that can act on that scale, how are we going to help both employers who are facing low revenues and having problems? How are we going to help their employees who really probably are having fewer and fewer options, both to work or to get continued UI benefits? Those are the kinds of questions that we're going to have to grapple with and are grappling with, and are really tops of the legislative agenda. I think right with it is that ongoing funding for COVID response. Because we set up a process in which we could get to December, January is just around the corner. So what are we going to do then? How are we going to respond to labor shortages and challenges in long-term care facilities where on a daily basis, we see some facilities with outbreaks where a lot of the staff can't work and you have vulnerable adults, where you see disruptions in food supply for entire communities. Those are the kinds of questions that we need to continue to focus on. Acting short term to get us to that spring, summer period where hopefully things can get returned to normal, where vaccinations can start to stabilize some of those critical services, and ultimately everyone can get outside and get back to normal.
So this next question is outside of your daily job, but through this time, we've seen so many businesses get creative on how they can just survive, especially I think about the restaurant industry and fun things they're doing. We're actually sponsoring this Bazingo game where people can get takeout and get bingo cards for tomorrow night's game, which is around St. Paul restaurants and bars. Have you, just in your own observation, seen any creative ways that businesses have found ways to survive that you've appreciated?
That's a great question. I don't have a offhand answer to that. I have certainly seen just, across the board, everyone is scrambling of ways. I know a restaurant down the street. I used to live in the Midway neighborhood. Now I'm in Eagan. But Cupcake, which used to be on University and is down the street, how they were serving up Thanksgiving meals. And we decided, we're going to support our local restaurant. And they had basically a nice process again of basically a Thanksgiving meal. If you didn't have flowers for your spouse, you can get them then. You can get the bottle of wine as well. It's like, I think we're all trying to figure out how to capture market, how to help each other, how to keep things going in our communities and across the state. And I just thank your members for going through this period, working together, being creative, and letting us know about those challenges, because I came into the state just a couple of months ago. I'd been a state official more than a decade ago through the Great Recession in the first term of Mark Dayton. And I can tell you right now, the amount of worry, the amount of balancing and competing demands that the Walz-Flanagan administration is going through is unbelievable, simply because of the need to respond to the short-term emergencies where none of us have a playbook, where all of us are learning and we're trying to do right. And I appreciate that that's what Minnesotans do. I appreciate that that's what's going to get us through. And I'm really happy that the November forecast gives us a little bit of good luck, a little bit of good news, and I think shows that our good management and our work for the long term pays off, because we have time to make some decisions. We aren't making some of the cutbacks that would further complicate our business community. And I think we're getting to a place where we understand the implications of COVID and how this recession is affecting the economy, so we can make some smart choices. So I really thank you, Chad. I thank the members for your time. I'm sorry it's kind of brief. I'm talking even faster than I usually do. But hopefully this gives you a taste of some of the challenges we're going through right now and some of the good news that the November forecast brought.
Well, thank you for your time, Commissioner. And the next forecast is February?
It will be late February.
All right. Well, let's hope for some good news then, too. Thanks for spending the morning with us. Thanks to our members for joining us today. This is recorded, so we know that we can share this with others. And I hope you can join us on Thursday when we meet our new PED director in St. Paul, Nicole Goodman. Thank you so much.
Thank you.